The Story of Black America. Part 1. Historical Context and Legacy of Slavery. 1. Origins of Slavery in the Americas. The Transatlantic Slave Trade. Its beginnings, operations, and scale. The transatlantic slave trade, often referred to as the Middle Passage, was one of the most significant and devastating human trafficking operations in history. It began in the early 16th century and lasted until the 19th century, though its effects are still deeply felt today. This system saw millions of Africans forcibly taken from their homeland, packed into ships, and transported across the Atlantic Ocean to work on plantations, in mines, and in households across the Americas. Beginnings of the trade. European exploration and colonization of the Americas created a need for cheap, reliable labor. Initially, indigenous populations were exploited, but due to diseases and resistance, they dwindled in number. As a result, European nations, particularly Portugal and Spain, began to import enslaved Africans to work on sugar, tobacco, and cotton plantations in the Caribbean and South America. Expansion of the slave trade. By the 17th century, England, France, and the Netherlands became involved in the transatlantic slave trade. British merchants established major slave ports in West Africa, where they traded goods such as firearms, textiles, and rum in exchange for human captives. Scale of the trade. By the time the trade ended in the 19th century, an estimated 12.5 million Africans had been enslaved and transported to the Americas. The majority of these slaves were taken to Brazil, the Caribbean, and the southern United States. The scale of the operation was staggering, with thousands of ships making the journey every year, each transporting hundreds of slaves. The development of the plantation economy in the Americas, particularly in the U.S. Slavery became a cornerstone of the plantation economy in the Americas, particularly in regions with the ideal climate and soil for cultivating cash crops like sugar, tobacco, cotton, and rice. Early plantations. The first successful plantations in the Americas were established in the Caribbean and South America. The demand for sugar was particularly high in Europe, and plantations required vast numbers of laborers. Enslaved Africans were brought in large numbers to work the fields. Expansion to North America. In the U.S., the plantation economy became central to the southern colonies. Tobacco was the first major crop to drive the demand for enslaved labor in Virginia, Maryland, and other southern colonies. By the late 18th century, cotton became the dominant crop, especially after the invention of the cotton gin in 1793, which made cotton production more efficient and profitable. Economic dependence on slavery. The success of plantation economies in the U.S. created a system where the economy, culture, and social structure were deeply intertwined with slavery. Slavery was not just an economic system, but also a social and political institution that shaped the structure of Southern society, influencing everything from family dynamics to laws and political systems. The racial hierarchy and how black people were dehumanized and enslaved. Slavery in the Americas was built upon a racial hierarchy that depicted black people as inherently inferior to whites. This hierarchy was used to justify the brutal treatment and exploitation of black Africans. Racial ideologies. As slavery expanded, the need for a racial ideology that could justify the treatment of Africans as property became essential. European colonizers, including English settlers, began to develop ideas of racial superiority, often tied to pseudoscientific beliefs that blacks were biologically inferior to whites. Dehumanization and legal structure. African slaves were stripped of their identities and reduced to commodities. Slave codes were enacted to further entrench the notion of black inferiority. These laws defined enslaved people as property, denying them any legal rights and subjecting them to inhumane treatment. Slaves could be bought, sold, punished, and even killed without consequence. Psychological and social impact. Enslaved Africans were subjected to violence, family separations, and forced labor. The dehumanization of black people affected not only their lives, but also their descendants for generations, leading to intergenerational trauma that persists to this day. 2. The abolition of slavery. Key abolitionist movements in Europe and the Americas. The fight against slavery was long and hard-fought, involving both black and white abolitionists across the world. Key figures, movements, and events helped bring an end to the transatlantic slave trade and, eventually, to slavery itself. Abolition in Europe. The abolition movement began in Europe in the late 18th century. Early abolitionists like Granville Sharp and Thomas Clarkson in England, alongside the Quakers, became vocal critics of slavery. Their work helped to spread awareness and build support for the movement. The British abolitionist movement culminated in the passage of the Slave Trade Act of 1807, which made it illegal to engage in the slave trade within the British Empire. Abolitionism in the Americas was fueled by a combination of moral, religious, economic, and political factors. In the U.S., figures like Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, and William Lloyd Garrison became key leaders in the movement. Tubman's work with the Underground Railroad helped many enslaved people escape to freedom in the North, while Douglass, a former slave himself, used his powerful writing and speeches to draw attention to the horrors of slavery. International movements. The abolition movement became a global cause, with major protests and petitions targeting colonial slave systems. In Haiti, a successful slave revolt in 1791 led to the abolition of slavery on the island, creating the first independent black republic. The American Civil War, the Emancipation Proclamation, and the end of slavery. The Civil War, 1861 to 1865, in the United States was the bloodiest conflict in American history and had slavery as its central issue. Causes of the war. Slavery was a central economic and political issue dividing the North and South. While northern states had moved toward abolishing slavery, the southern states depended on enslaved labor for their agricultural economy. Tensions boiled over with the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860, who opposed the expansion of slavery into new territories. The Civil War and the battle over slavery. The Confederacy was formed by southern states that sought to preserve slavery. The Union, led by President Lincoln, fought to preserve the nation. While the Civil War initially began as a fight to maintain the Union, it became increasingly focused on the abolition of slavery. Emancipation Proclamation. In 1863, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which declared all slaves in Confederate-held territory to be free. Though the proclamation did not immediately end slavery, it was a pivotal moment in the fight for abolition, and it also allowed black men to join the Union Army. The 13th Amendment. In 1865, the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution was passed, officially ending slavery in all states and territories. The societal and economic adjustments after emancipation. The abolition of slavery left the Southern economy and social structure in disarray. Emancipation created immediate challenges and opportunities for freed blacks and the white population. Freedmen's Bureau. Established in 1865, the Freedmen's Bureau helped newly freed black people transition from slavery to freedom. It provided food, housing, education, and legal support, but its efforts were limited by political opposition and Southern resistance. Sharecropping. While slavery was abolished, many Southern black people were still tied to the land through sharecropping, a system that exploited their labor and kept them in poverty. Although they were technically free, the structure of debt and land ownership continued to oppress black people. 3. Post-Reconstruction era and Jim Crow laws. The failure of Reconstruction and the rise of white supremacy. After the Civil War, the U.S. entered the Reconstruction era, 1865 to 1877, where the federal government attempted to rebuild the South and integrate formerly enslaved people into society. Reconstruction challenges. Reconstruction was marked by political battles, racial violence, and resistance from white Southerners. While the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments guaranteed civil rights to freed black people, the South implemented laws and practices designed to undermine these rights. Rise of white supremacy. The end of Reconstruction in 1877, following the contested election of Rutherford B. Hayes, marked the rise of Jim Crow laws and the solidification of white supremacy. Groups like the Ku Klux Klan terrorized black communities, seeking to restore white control over the South. The institutionalization of racial segregation and disenfranchisement. After Reconstruction, the Southern states enacted Jim Crow laws to enforce racial segregation. Jim Crow laws. These laws legalized segregation in public spaces, schools, transportation, and more. Black people were excluded from political power, and discriminatory practices like literacy tests, poll taxes, and grandfather clauses prevented many black people from voting. Economic discrimination. Black Americans were largely confined to low-wage, manual labor jobs and faced exclusion from most professions. Sharecropping and tenant farming kept many black families in a cycle of poverty. The development of black codes, segregation laws, and the impact on black Americans. Black codes and segregation laws restricted the rights of black people to own property, travel freely, or even exist without being policed. Black codes. These laws, enacted in southern states, were meant to control the labor and behavior of newly freed slaves. They restricted mobility, restricted access to education, and enforced harsh penalties for trivial offenses. Impact on Black Americans. Black Americans face constant violence, legal restrictions, and disenfranchisement. Many moved north in search of better opportunities, though they found that racism and discrimination existed in the North as well. 4. The Civil Rights Movement. The fight for equality in the 20th century. The Civil Rights Movement was a pivotal period in U.S. history as African Americans fought for their constitutional rights and an end to racial discrimination. Key figures. Leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, Malcolm X, and Thurgood Marshall became central to the struggle for civil rights. They advocated for everything from desegregation to voting rights, mass protest, and nonviolent resistance. The movement was marked by acts of nonviolent resistance, such as the Montgomery bus boycott 1955 and the March on Washington 1963, where King delivered his famous I Have a Dream speech. Landmark legislation. Civil Rights Act of 1964, Voting Rights Act of 1965. Civil Rights Act. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was a landmark piece of legislation that outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin in employment, education, and public accommodations. Voting Rights Act. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 sought to eliminate racial discrimination in voting, particularly in the South, where literacy tests, poll taxes, and intimidation tactics were used to disenfranchise Black voters. Social, political, and economic shifts post-civil rights movement. Following the civil rights movement, significant gains were made in racial equality, but many challenges remain. Post-civil rights America. The end of legal segregation and the passage of civil rights laws were monumental victories, but they didn't eliminate systemic racism or economic inequality. The Black Power movement also sought to create a sense of pride and self-sufficiency in Black communities. Ongoing struggles. Issues like police brutality, economic inequality, and educational disparities continue to challenge Black Americans in the post-civil rights era. Though much progress has been made, the full promise of equality and justice remains unfulfilled. Part 2. Systemic Racism and Inequality. 1. Racism in Law and Policy. How laws and policies throughout history have discriminated against Black Americans. The history of Black Americans is marked by institutionalized legal systems that created and perpetuated racial inequality. Legal discrimination began with slavery and continued through to the 20th century in the form of segregation, disenfranchisement, and exclusionary laws. Slave codes and the Constitution. Laws defining enslaved individuals as property, not people, set the tone for institutionalized racism. The U.S. Constitution, particularly the 3/5 Clause, codified Black inferiority, enabling political and social systems to marginalize Black Americans for centuries. The Black Codes and Jim Crow laws. Following the Civil War and Emancipation, Black codes were introduced in the South to restrict the freedoms of newly freed African Americans. They ensured Black people would remain subjugated through restrictions on employment, property ownership, and movement. These evolved into Jim Crow laws, which mandated racial segregation in all public spaces, from schools to transportation, ensuring that Black Americans were denied equal access to public services and social participation. Voting restrictions and disenfranchisement. Laws like poll taxes, literacy tests, and grandfather clauses were implemented to prevent Black people from voting, even after the passage of the 15th Amendment in 1870, which legally prohibited racial discrimination in voting. The impact of redlining, the GI Bill, and other racially exclusionary policies. Post-slavery policies continued to maintain racial inequality, especially in housing, education, and economic opportunities. Notable discriminatory policies include redlining, the GI Bill, and various housing and employment policies that restricted Black Americans' access to wealth-building opportunities. Redlining. In the 1930s, the Federal Housing Administration, FHA, created maps to assess risk for mortgage lending, marking predominantly Black neighborhoods as high risk. This practice of redlining made it impossible for Black families to obtain loans for home ownership, preventing them from building wealth and perpetuating racial segregation in housing. Redlining affected generations of Black families by preventing them from accessing the economic advantages of homeownership. The GI Bill. After World War II, the GI Bill provided veterans with benefits like home loans and education grants. However, Black veterans were often denied these benefits due to discriminatory practices, including the refusal of banks and educational institutions to serve them. As a result, black veterans were excluded from the post-war economic boom that benefited many white Americans. Social Security and labor laws. New Deal policies like Social Security, unemployment insurance, and labor protections initially excluded many black workers. Agricultural and domestic workers, fields where black people were heavily employed, were not included in these benefits, further deepening the wealth gap and economic disparities. The prison industrial complex and its disproportionate effect on black communities. The prison industrial complex represents a system where the incarceration of black Americans serves both punitive and economic purposes. This system is deeply intertwined with the history of racial inequality and mass incarceration. The war on drugs. The war on drugs, which began in the 1980s, disproportionately targeted black communities. Laws such as mandatory minimum sentences and sentencing disparities between crack and powder cocaine resulted in higher incarceration rates for black Americans. These policies, which were implemented under the guise of fighting drug crime, disproportionately affected black men and families. Private prisons and profit. The rise of private prisons has led to the commodification of incarceration, where profits are tied to the number of prisoners, particularly in black communities. This has created a cycle where prisons rely on racially biased policing and sentencing practices to maintain high incarceration rates. The school-to-prison pipeline. Discriminatory practices in schools, such as harsh disciplinary policies and racial profiling, contribute to the criminalization of black youth. The school-to-prison pipeline refers to the ways in which educational institutions push students, particularly black students, from classrooms into the criminal justice system. 2. Economic disparities and wealth gaps. Historical economic disadvantages faced by black Americans. From slavery to the present day, black Americans have faced systemic barriers to economic success. These barriers are rooted in historical exploitation, disenfranchisement, and exclusion from key wealth-building opportunities. Slavery and economic exploitation. During slavery, black people were denied any form of compensation for their labor, which directly benefited the economy of the South. After emancipation, many freed black people were left with no resources, while white landowners continued to profit from the labor of black people under systems like sharecropping. The Great Migration and economic inequality. Between 1916 and 1970, millions of black people moved from the rural South to urban centers in the North in search of better job opportunities. However, these migrants often face discrimination in housing and employment, limiting their ability to accumulate wealth. Exclusion from New Deal programs. Many New Deal programs, designed to alleviate the effects of the Great Depression, excluded or disadvantaged black Americans. The Social Security Act of 1935, for example, initially excluded agricultural and domestic workers, sectors dominated by black labor. The racial wealth gap. Causes and consequences. The racial wealth gap, the disparity in assets between black and white Americans, is one of the most glaring manifestations of systemic racism. It is a result of historical exclusion from wealth-building opportunities and discriminatory practices. Wealth accumulation and inheritance. White Americans were able to accumulate wealth over generations through home ownership, education, and inheritance. Conversely, black Americans were often excluded from these opportunities, particularly through practices like redlining and employment discrimination. The role of employment and wages. Black workers have consistently faced lower wages than their white counterparts. This wage gap has persisted for decades, exacerbated by discriminatory hiring practices and unequal access to higher-paying jobs. The legacy of slavery and economic disadvantage. The generational wealth gap between black and white families traces back to slavery. Enslaved people were deprived of any economic returns from their labor, which denied them the ability to build wealth. This historical injustice continues to affect black families today. The role of education, healthcare, and employment in perpetuating inequality. The intersection of race and systemic inequality in education, healthcare, and employment has perpetuated the economic disadvantage of black Americans. Education. Schools in predominantly black neighborhoods tend to receive less funding, have fewer resources, and face more challenges than schools in predominantly white neighborhoods. This disparity limits opportunities for black children and perpetuates the cycle of poverty. Healthcare. Black Americans face disparities in healthcare, including limited access to quality care, higher rates of chronic illness, and lower life expectancy. This contributes to the broader economic disadvantage, as health issues can limit career opportunities and economic stability. Employment. Discrimination in hiring, unequal pay, and lack of access to job training contribute to economic inequality for Black Americans. Studies consistently show that Black people face higher unemployment rates and are often excluded from high-paying industries and positions. 3. The impact of media and cultural stereotypes. The role of media in shaping perceptions of Black people. The media plays a significant role in shaping public perception of Black people. Historically, the portrayal of Black Americans in the media has often been negative, perpetuating stereotypes and reinforcing racial biases. The representation of Black people in Hollywood and popular culture. Early film and television often depicted Black characters as stereotypes, subservient, criminal, or comedic figures. This reinforced the idea of Black inferiority and limited the representation of Black people in empowering roles. The news media. News outlets often focus on negative stories involving Black individuals, reinforcing biases about criminality, poverty, and violence. The overrepresentation of Black people in crime reporting creates a racialized image of Black communities. Changing representation. In recent decades, there has been a push for more accurate and diverse representation of Black people in the media. However, the struggle for fair and nuanced portrayals continues as Black actors, writers, and directors work to challenge negative stereotypes. Stereotypes and their impact on the lived experiences of Black Americans. Stereotypes about Black people, such as the welfare queen, criminal, and lazy, have profound effects on the lived experiences of Black Americans. Impact on employment and education. Stereotypes can affect hiring decisions, admissions to educational institutions, and interactions with authority figures. Black people are often judged based on their race, which limits their opportunities and perpetuates inequality. Racial profiling and police brutality. Stereotypes contribute to racial profiling by law enforcement, resulting in disproportionate surveillance arrest and violence directed at Black communities. The belief that Black people are more likely to commit crimes has led to unjust treatment by the police and the criminal justice system. Psychological and social effects of systemic racism. The psychological toll of systemic racism is significant, affecting not just individual mental health, but also the well-being of entire communities. Mental health and racial discrimination. Studies have shown that experiences of racial discrimination, whether overt or subtle, contribute to high rates of anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, among Black Americans. Constant exposure to racism can lead to a phenomenon known as racial battle fatigue, a condition where Black individuals experience heightened stress and emotional exhaustion from dealing with racism. Social isolation and identity struggles. Systemic racism creates environments in which Black people feel isolated, stigmatized, and marginalized. This can affect their sense of identity and self-worth. Moreover, children growing up in racially unequal environments are more likely to experience negative psychological outcomes, which can impact their future success and well-being. Long-term social effects. The social effects of systemic racism are intergenerational, meaning that the psychological damage, economic disadvantages, and social stigma faced by one generation can carry over to the next. Black Americans, particularly in low-income areas, are often caught in a cycle of disadvantage that is perpetuated by social, economic, and cultural factors. Systemic racism is a deeply ingrained issue in American society. It manifests through discriminatory laws and policies, economic disparity, media portrayals, and social and psychological harm. While progress has been made, the legacy of historical inequality continues to shape the lives of Black Americans. Understanding the breadth and depth of systemic racism is crucial for addressing these persistent disparities and working toward a more equitable society. Part 3. Social and Cultural Movements. 1. The Civil Rights Movement. The fight for equality in the 20th century. The Civil Rights Movement, which emerged in the mid-20th century, was a pivotal moment in American history. It was a mass movement that sought to end racial segregation, disenfranchisement, and the systemic inequality that Black Americans faced. The early 20th century civil rights organizations. Before the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s, organizations like the NAACP, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, founded in 1909, had already been working to challenge legal segregation and discrimination. Legal challenges to segregation, such as the landmark case Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, set the stage for the larger movement. The role of black leadership. Key figures like Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, Malcolm X, and John Lewis were instrumental in leading the fight for civil rights. Martin Luther King Jr.'s philosophy of nonviolent resistance and civil disobedience inspired millions, while Malcolm X's radical rhetoric resonated with those who felt that peaceful resistance was insufficient in addressing the violence and oppression they faced. The Montgomery bus boycott and other early protests. In 1955, Rosa Parks' refusal to give up her seat on a segregated bus in Montgomery, Alabama, sparked the Montgomery bus boycott. This boycott, led by King, was one of the first successful mass mobilizations in the civil rights movement. Similar protests, sit-ins, and freedom rides followed across the country, challenging racial segregation in public spaces and transportation. Landmark legislation. Civil Rights Act of 1964, Voting Rights Act of 1965. The civil rights movement was successful in securing a series of landmark laws that helped dismantle legal segregation and protect the rights of black Americans. The Civil Rights Act of 1964. One of the most significant pieces of legislation in American history, the Civil Rights Act prohibited discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. It outlawed segregation in schools, public places, and employment, marking a crucial step toward achieving racial equality. The Voting Rights Act of 1965. This law aimed to eliminate the various barriers, such as literacy tests and poll taxes, that had been used to disenfranchise black voters. The act was a key victory in the struggle for political representation, particularly in the South, where many black Americans had been systematically denied the right to vote. The social, political, and economic shifts post-civil rights movement. While the civil rights movement achieved many legal victories, the social, political, and economic realities of black Americans did not change overnight. Post-civil rights America saw both gains and setbacks for black communities. The rise of black power. In the late 1960s and 1970s, the Black Power movement emerged, which called for greater political and economic empowerment for black Americans. It emphasized racial pride, cultural identity, and self-reliance. This was seen in the formation of groups like the Black Panther Party, which aimed to address the systemic inequalities black communities faced, including police brutality, poor housing, and inadequate health care. Desegregation and its challenges. While desegregation efforts were made following the Civil Rights Act and Brown versus Board of Education, many southern states resisted or implemented systems of massive resistance to prevent full integration. De facto segregation persisted in many areas, particularly in schools and housing. Economic struggles. Despite the legal victories, black Americans continued to face significant economic challenges, including high unemployment, low wages, and lack of access to quality education. These issues were exacerbated by the end of the post-war economic boom and the subsequent rise of deindustrialization, which hit inner-city black communities the hardest. 2. Affirmative action and equal opportunity programs. The implementation of affirmative action. Affirmative action policies were introduced as a way to address the historical discrimination faced by minority groups, particularly black Americans, in education and employment. These policies aimed to ensure that black individuals had access to the same opportunities that had long been denied. The origins of affirmative action. The concept of affirmative action was first introduced by President John F. Kennedy in 1961, with an executive order that required federal contractors to take affirmative steps to ensure non-discriminatory hiring practices. The goal was to level the playing field for historically marginalized groups. The role of the Supreme Court. Key Supreme Court decisions, such as Regents of the University of California versus Bakke, 1978, which upheld affirmative action but also imposed limitations on racial quotas, shaped the ongoing debate over these policies. The court's decisions underscored the tension between promoting equality and preventing reverse discrimination. Affirmative action in education and employment. Colleges and universities adopted affirmative action policies to increase the representation of black and other minority students. Similarly, businesses and government agencies implemented hiring quotas or diversity programs to address racial imbalances. Despite the intention of these policies, they have remained controversial, with critics arguing that they promote reverse discrimination, while supporters maintain that they are necessary to remedy systemic racism. The impact of affirmative action on black communities. The debate over affirmative action has continued into the 21st century, with different states passing laws either banning or reaffirming affirmative action programs. Increased access to education. Affirmative action has increased the number of black students in higher education institutions, offering them opportunities that were previously inaccessible due to discriminatory practices. However, it has also sparked debates about merit and fairness in university admissions. Workplace diversity. In the workplace, affirmative action led to greater diversity in hiring, opening doors for black professionals in industries that had long been closed to them. Nevertheless, critics argue that the focus on diversity and quotas often ignores the deeper structural barriers that continue to limit true equality in the workforce. 3. Black Lives Matter movement and contemporary struggles. The rise of the Black Lives Matter movement. The Black Lives Matter (BLM) movement emerged in response to high-profile incidents of police brutality and racial injustice, such as the deaths of Trayvon Martin 2012, Michael Brown 2014, and George Floyd 2020. The founding of Black Lives Matter. In 2013, 3 black women, Alicia Garza, Patrisse Cullors, and Opal Tometi, created a hashtag Black Lives Matter, which quickly gained traction on social media as a response to the acquittal of George Zimmerman in the shooting death of Trayvon Martin. BLM grew into a global movement calling for an end to police violence, racial profiling, and racial inequality. Police brutality and racial profiling. The movement focused on addressing the disproportionate use of force by police against black people. Protests, such as those in Ferguson, Missouri, after the killing of Michael Brown, brought national attention to the issue of police violence. The death of George Floyd in 2020 sparked widespread protests, highlighting systemic issues of racism in law enforcement and calling for broader reform. The role of social media. Social media played a crucial role in amplifying the voices of black activists, documenting incidents of police violence, and organizing protests. The viral nature of videos showing police violence against black individuals brought these issues to the forefront of national and global discussions. The push for criminal justice reform. The Black Lives Matter movement has advocated for a range of reforms to address the inequities within the criminal justice system. Defunding the police. One of the most contentious demands of the movement has been the call to defund the police. Advocates argue that funds should be redirected from police departments to community programs, mental health services, and education, aiming to reduce the reliance on law enforcement and address the root causes of crime, such as poverty and inequality. Ending mass incarceration. The BLM movement has also focused on addressing mass incarceration, which disproportionately impacts black communities. This includes advocating for the abolition of private prisons, reforming sentencing laws, and decriminalizing certain offenses, particularly drug-related crimes, that have historically led to the disproportionate incarceration of black people. Reparations. The movement has renewed discussions around reparations for slavery and racial injustice, advocating for policies that compensate black Americans for the wealth and opportunities that were denied due to systemic racism. The future of racial justice movements. The struggle for racial justice is ongoing, with Black Lives Matter and other movements continuing to call for systemic change. As the movement gains global recognition, there is an increasing focus on addressing racial inequality beyond the United States, with demands for justice and reparations echoing in countries worldwide. Global solidarity. The BLM movement has inspired solidarity movements around the world, from Europe to Africa, as people unite in the fight against systemic racism and injustice. The international reach of the movement underscores the global nature of racial inequality and the interconnectedness of struggles for justice. The role of youth activism. Younger generations are increasingly involved in racial justice movements, bringing new perspectives and approaches to activism. Social media continues to play a crucial role in organizing protests, raising awareness, and creating platforms for marginalized voices. Future challenges and goals. While significant progress has been made, the struggle for racial equality is far from over. The future of racial justice movements will depend on the continued fight for economic equality, educational access, criminal justice reform, and cultural representation, as well as broader societal changes in attitudes toward race and equality. Part 4. Political representation and activism. 1. The role of black politicians and leaders. Early political engagement and resistance. Historically, black political participation in the U.S. was severely restricted. especially in the South, due to disenfranchisement practices like poll taxes, literacy tests, and outright violence. Despite these challenges, there were early efforts to establish black political power, Reconstruction and black representation. After the Civil War, during Reconstruction, black Americans briefly gained political power. The passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments granted them citizenship and the right to vote. Notable figures such as Hiram Revels and Blanche K. Bruce were elected to Congress during this period, symbolizing the potential for black political power. However, the end of Reconstruction in 1877 marked the beginning of a systematic effort to disenfranchise black voters, particularly in the South. The role of black organizations. Organizations such as the National Negro Business League, established by Booker T. Washington, and the NAACP became vital in advocating for the rights of black Americans and creating avenues for political representation. These organizations often lobbied for laws to combat racial injustice and push for increased political participation. The rise of black political leaders. Throughout the 20th century, black leaders began to gain prominence in American politics, many of whom were shaped by the struggles for racial equality and justice. W.B. Du Bois and political advocacy. Du Bois, a co-founder of the NAACP, argued for full civil rights and political participation for black Americans. His influential works, such as The Souls of Black Folk, not only analyzed racial inequality, but also advocated for higher education and political empowerment as means to combat segregation and disenfranchisement. The impact of the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement provided a backdrop for political activism among black Americans. Leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., who were initially focused on social change, also began to navigate the political landscape, influencing legislation such as the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. Black elected officials in the 20th century. The first significant wave of black politicians in the 20th century included figures such as Shirley Chisholm, the first black woman elected to Congress, and Carl Stokes, who became the first black mayor of a major U.S. city, Cleveland, 1967. These leaders began to influence local and national politics, advocating for policies to benefit black Americans and marginalized communities. Modern political influence. Barack Obama and beyond. In the 21st century, the political representation of black Americans reached new heights, with the election of Barack Obama as the 44th President of the United States in 2008. Obama's presidency was a milestone in American politics, symbolizing progress, but also highlighting the continuing racial divides in the country. Obama's presidency. Obama's election represented a historic moment as he became the first black president of the U.S. His presidency, however, faced significant challenges. While he passed landmark healthcare reform with the Affordable Care Act and pursued criminal justice reforms, he also faced intense opposition rooted in racial animus. His time in office reflected both the progress that had been made and the deeply ingrained racial tensions in the country. Black Lives Matter and political mobilization. The Black Lives Matter movement significantly shaped the political discourse surrounding racial inequality. BLM not only advocated for changes to the criminal justice system, but also called for increased black political power. The movement influenced the 2020 presidential election, with issues of police brutality, racial inequality, and justice playing key roles. The increasing number of black politicians. Today, black Americans are represented in local, state, and national offices at unprecedented rates. Figures like Kamala Harris, who became the first black and South Asian vice president, and Stacey Abrams, who played a pivotal role in mobilizing voters in Georgia, are shaping the future of black political power. 2. The role of black activism in shaping public policy. Grassroots activism and organizing. Black activism has always been a driving force behind policy changes. From the abolition of slavery to the civil rights movement, activism has been crucial in shaping public discourse and legislation. The early 20th century activism. The early black activism of the 20th century included leaders like Marcus Garvey, who promoted black nationalism, and Ida B. Wells, whose anti-lynching campaigns brought national attention to racial violence. These grassroots movements laid the groundwork for larger efforts to address racial inequality. The civil rights movement's legacy. The grassroots nature of the civil rights movement, which involved local organizing, sit-ins, boycotts, and marches, created a template for modern activism. Leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. used civil disobedience to engage directly with the public and put pressure on lawmakers to pass necessary reforms. The emergence of new activism. In the 21st century, activism has expanded with the advent of social media. Movements such as Black Lives Matter and #SayHerName are examples of how technology has revolutionized organizing. Through social media platforms, Black activists have been able to spread awareness of racial injustice, organize protests, and mobilize voters in ways that were not possible in previous decades. Policy changes and legislative influence. Black activism has led to several key policy changes, particularly in the areas of criminal justice, education, and voting rights. The fight for voting rights. One of the most significant battles of Black activism was for the right to vote. The Voting Rights Act of 1965, a result of years of protest and legal challenges, eliminated many of the obstacles to Black voter participation in the South. However, activists have continued to challenge voter suppression laws, which disproportionately impact Black communities, especially in the wake of the Supreme Court's 2013 decision to strike down key provisions of the Voting Rights Act. Criminal justice reform. Activism around police brutality and mass incarceration has led to important shifts in the criminal justice landscape. The Black Lives Matter movement, for example, has sparked a national conversation about police reform, the end of mass incarceration, and accountability for law enforcement. Educational equity. Activists have also fought for educational reforms, including equitable funding for public schools, desegregation, and access to higher education. The fight for educational equality continues, as disparities persist in school funding, school discipline, and access to college scholarships. Intersectionality and activism. In recent years, activism has become more intersectional, recognizing that race, gender, sexuality, and class all play a role in the lived experiences of Black people. The role of Black women in activism. Black women have been at the forefront of many social movements, from the civil rights movement to Black Lives Matter. Figures like Angela Davis, Audre Lorde, and Kimberly Crenshaw have challenged both racial and gender inequalities, advocating for policies that address the unique challenges faced by Black women. LGBTQ plus Black activism. The intersection of race and sexual orientation has also become an important area of activism. Black LGBTQ plus activists such as Marsha P. Johnson and Bayard Rustin fought not only for racial justice, but for LGBTQ plus rights. Today, the intersectionality of race and sexuality is central to modern social movements, with activists pushing for both racial and LGBTQ plus equality. 3. The challenges and limitations of Black political power. Political polarization, and racism. Despite significant gains, Black Americans still face challenges in fully exercising their political power. Political polarization. The U.S. is increasingly polarized along racial, ideological, and partisan lines. While many Black Americans are active participants in the Democratic Party, Republican opposition to policies like voting rights and police reform reflects deeper partisan divides. The polarization limits the ability to enact comprehensive reforms that address systemic racism. Voter suppression. Efforts to restrict voting rights in key battleground states, especially in the wake of the 2020 election, have created significant obstacles to Black political power. From voter ID laws to the closing of polling places in predominantly Black neighborhoods, Black voters continue to face challenges in casting their ballots. Racial discrimination in politics. Black politicians, despite their increasing numbers, often face racism, both overt and systemic, within the political system. Whether it's through discriminatory voter suppression laws or the marginalization of Black voices within political parties, racism remains a barrier to true political equality. Economic inequality and political influence. Economic inequality often intersects with political power, and the wealth gap between Black and white Americans limits the ability of Black communities to influence politics in a meaningful way. Political donations and wealth disparities. Wealth disparities impact political influence. Wealthy white Americans and corporations often dominate political donations and lobbying efforts, leaving Black communities at a disadvantage. The influence of money in politics limits the power of working-class Black Americans to push for policy changes that would benefit them. Discrimination in government programs. Even in the realm of government programs intended to help disadvantaged communities, Black Americans often face discrimination. Historically, Black families have been excluded from many welfare and housing programs, and today, they continue to experience inequities in government assistance programs. 4. The future of Black political power. Increasing representation. As the U.S. becomes more racially diverse, the future of black political power is increasingly tied to demographic shifts. Black Americans are now a critical voting bloc, particularly in swing states like Georgia and Michigan. Increasing political representation at all levels of government is key to advancing racial equality. The role of young black voters. The youth vote is becoming increasingly significant. Young black voters have played a critical role in recent elections, pushing issues like criminal justice reform, healthcare access, and climate change to the forefront of political discourse. The future of black leadership. Black leadership is evolving, with figures like Kamala Harris and Stacey Abrams demonstrating that the future of black political power will likely involve a blend of grassroots organizing and institutional power. New forms of activism, including digital organizing, and the increasing involvement of black women in politics, will shape the future of black political influence. Part 5. Political representation and activism. While the struggle for civil rights had made significant progress, black Americans continued to face an uphill battle for political power. During the 1960s and 1970s, black leaders like Shirley Chisholm and Carl Stokes began to pave the way for black political representation, proving that black people could not only protest injustice, but also take power within the political system. Chisholm became the first black woman elected to Congress, and Stokes became the first black mayor of a major U.S. city. Their victories were symbolic, but also indicative of a broader shift in the political landscape. Black Americans were no longer content to simply demand change. They were organizing, running for office, and winning. In the 21st century, Barack Obama's election as the first black president marked a historic moment in American history. Yet his presidency, while significant, also revealed the deep-seated racial divides in the country. Obama's tenure was marked by both progress and resistance, with his policies often facing intense opposition from those who viewed him as a threat to the established order. The Black Lives Matter movement emerged in response to the continued police violence and systemic injustice that black Americans faced. From the killing of Trayvon Martin to the deaths of Michael Brown, Eric Garner, and Breonna Taylor, BLM became a call to action for those who believed that the fight for racial justice was far from over. BLM not only focused on policing but on broader issues like voting rights, housing inequality, and economic justice. Part 6. The Future of Black America. As black Americans continue to face challenges, they also continue to thrive. The future of black political power looks bright, with increasing numbers of black elected officials at local, state, and national levels. Figures like Kamala Harris, the first black and South Asian vice president, represent a shift in the political landscape. The struggle for justice continues in many forms, from efforts to restore the Voting Rights Act to calls for police reform and reparations for slavery. The younger generation of black activists, empowered by technology and social media, has brought a new sense of urgency to the cause. Movements like Black Lives Matter have shown that the fight for equality is ongoing and that systemic racism continues to be a pervasive force in American society. As black Americans continue to break barriers, the question of how to overcome systemic racism remains. The future is uncertain, but the determination to achieve true equality burns brightly. Epilogue. A story of perseverance. The story of black Americans is one of resistance, resilience, and hope. It is a story that spans centuries, filled with unspeakable horrors and extraordinary triumphs. From the time of slavery to the fight for civil rights, from the political victories of the 20th century to the ongoing struggle for racial equality, black Americans have been at the forefront of America's moral and political evolution. Though the fight is not over, and though the scars of history remain, the black community continues to build a future where equality, justice, and opportunity will one day be realized for all.